May I speak in the name of our ever-living, ever-loving, and ever-leading God. Amen. One of those words that I learned in school that has always stuck with me because it's been particularly useful in understanding the Bible is the word allegory. And many, though not all, but many of the parables of Jesus fit this category, as well as other texts in the gospel. They are all stories that help us in some ways understand the significance of a story. But we must always remember that allegories, whatever the context, are not 100% fitting and accurate to a situation, and so we shouldn't get too carried away. But the allegory we heard today in this parable, some call it the parable of the vineyard, but there have been several stories about vineyards we've heard over the several weeks. And so I like the more old-fashioned term, the parable of the wicked tenants, to fit our context for today. This parable in some ways is simple. The great John Calvin, the Protestant reformer, said in his commentary on this parable that there are really two great theological points that are of continuing relevance. One, those who follow Jesus Christ, and especially those who seek to lead others to follow Jesus Christ, should expect resistance. Should expect, in fact, from others who may be religious leaders of themselves to try to hinder the reign of Christ. But two, whatever contrivances are mounted against the church, God will be victorious. Now, this particular story we heard that Jesus recounted is intense. It's, in fact, could be frightening. But the intensity of the allegory is in some ways because of the time of year we are living in. It is now October, let alone it is still in a pandemic. In less than 2 months, we will celebrate the first Sunday of Advent, and thus we approach the feast of Christ the King at the end of this church year. And so the readings we have, like today, in the preaching of Jesus relate often to that final week of his life in Jerusalem before the crucifixion. Jesus knows he has little time left, and we need to know, in fact, we may have little time left. And so the intensity of the story is meant to grab our attention. This gospel, of course, for Jesus is really an allegory of Jesus foreshadowing his own death. The son of the landowner is seized, thrown out of the vineyard, and killed. But that is not the last word of the story. And more importantly than the idea of those wicked tenants being punished and new tenants who will produce fruit and follow God's command, is not, I would say, not our great takeaway. Instead, it is for us to examine ourselves to see how do we bear the good fruit of good tenants. Well, we do so as Jesus consistently talks about, respecting the dignity of every human being, as we say in our baptismal covenant. And it will require for us, as they say in recovery 12-step programs, a brutal and honest self-examination. That is done on a personal level for each of us, where we fall short of God's glory, where we miss the mark. And it is for us in our communities, where we live among each other, in our nation, and dare I say, in the world, as we struggle with things like climate change. This nation, for example, maintained slavery for 246 years and then practiced various forms of segregation for another 100. America was able to do this because they defined black people as other, not fully human. We very nearly wiped out the native and indigenous tribes, not only on this continent, but in the islands of Hawaii and Alaska and elsewhere. And there have been other nations who have rejected God by the way of rejecting some of God's people. Germany employed the Holocaust. The Soviet Union used gulags, worked in labor camps in Siberia. It was called apartheid in South Africa and ethnic cleansing in the Balkan regions of Europe and Central Africa. And still now, in 21st century India, there is still a group called the Untouchables. In Australia and New Zealand, or Aotearoa, they struggle, in fact, still with people who were indigenous to those lands. What has in fact been remarkable is this past summer, when all the attention in America on racial reckoning, I think that countries throughout the globe came in support and solidarity of Black Lives Matter because they understood, in fact, that there are black people, at least in a figurative sense, everywhere who have been othered. And we recall our history and even our tragic present not for shame and blame or guilt, but for that honest and real self-examination that John the Baptist and Jesus calls us to. For that is the only way we can begin the journey into full light and life and joy, into building the beloved community. I want to finish with a story or a person who is an example that I've read him for years, and I've noticed in the past 6, 7, 8 years a real conversion, literally a conversion in his life. David Brooks, a well-known Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, a columnist, in fact, probably described as right of center, or maybe now he would just say center. He was successful almost from the time he finished school or before he finished school. And he married and had children, and he found out the true midlife crisis that he was not a really good person. His first marriage ended and he was estranged from his children. He considered himself a respectful, moral, but an agnostic or an atheist. And he felt that was enough. But he was so, as he recognizes now, so detached from his feelings, from his authentic and true self, and sadly then detached or disconnected from other human beings. Time doesn't allow me to go into the whole details, but through allowing others into his life, through using, in fact, I think a journalist's eye and the humility to recognize that there is a God who gives people souls, and those souls is what makes us unique as human beings. He came to find God, and by finding God, he learned how to love. He has written about it. He found love and life in a new marriage. He reconnected with his children and even his former wife to understand what it is to grow into that full stature of Christ. David Brooks, I don't know if he would call himself a Christian. He actually had this Jewish roots. But I think he understands, as Paul said in the first reading we heard, that while you are able to forget what lies behind and strain forward to what lies ahead, I press on towards the goal of the prize of the heavenly call of God. It requires for us, like David Brooks, that kind of brutal, honest self-examination. It requires us to get out of where we are as tenants who think that what we see in front of us is all we have, and that we can get away with stealing and intimidation and deception and even violence to get ahead in this world. But we are called to love unconditionally, even those who hate us, even those who oppose us. For we are called, like Paul and like Jesus Christ and countless of other disciples through the ages, to love generously. May God help us in that journey, not only today, but for the rest of our lives. Amen.